Well, hello, Richard Landis.
Hi.
If there's one person I want to talk to on a day that a war is starting, I think it's good to have you here.
Yeah.
So you get the honor of being my first guest. We have no idea how this is going to sound or look, and we're sitting at a ping pong table. We're in the center of Tel Aviv. There's a construction site around us, so I think this is a perfect time and place to have a podcast. So I'm glad you're my first guest, and
Thank you very much.
welcome. What are your thoughts on what's happening in Europe today? What are the forces that you see at play? We have to have a few words about this madness before we go on to what we plan to discuss.
Right. Actually, one of the interesting things about Europe is that if you had told me before the year 2000 that envy was a deadly sin, I would have laughed and said, everybody, there's lots of envy, but it's not deadly. And then starting in 2000, and even worse after 9/11, I all of a sudden noticed that here are the Europeans who are piling it on both Israel and the United States, effectively, if not openly, defending and supporting jihad, not realizing that they're targets, and preening as moral Europe. Sweden was probably the worst, moral Sweden, and so on. And I was just struck by this phenomenon of a civilization that was, in some senses, committing suicide just in order to preen morally on the world stage as sort of occupying the moral high ground. The worst of it was Jenin. We can come back to that later, but at that point, one Norwegian said that now Israel's lost the moral high ground. And that was a theme that you heard a lot. And so, essentially, in my mind, since 2000, Europe has been adopting policies that weaken her even as they're convinced it's strengthening her. And perhaps the most symbolic aspect of that is that in 2005, there were about 4 books that came out with the title of, the most egregious was Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. And they were all based on this notion that, we've now moved to, now that the Soviet Union's gone, we've moved to this positive sum, civic, soft power world, and Europe, the European Union, is the symbol of this and will, as a result of it, be the most powerful player in this new soft power 21st century. At the same time, a series of books came out, most famous being Batya Or's Eurabia, in which she said the Europeans are committing suicide, and before the end of the century, it's going to be a Muslim continent. And there's just no question that the European elite much preferred the narcissistic version to the warning. And I think that what we're looking at today is a situation in which Europe, exhibits all the weaknesses of a society that's based on a presumption of positive sum, when in fact not only is Russia playing by zero sum, but even within Europe. I mean, we saw it with the case of COVID. Each country was playing their game, and Europe was extraordinarily ineffective in dealing with the crisis of COVID. So, I mean, as a historian of, let's say, specifically the Middle Ages, but, I'm looking at least a 2,000-year period of human history. The zero-sum rules of power play, rule or be ruled, which is what the Chinese and the Russians and the Arab world are playing by, are the norm. And it's only in the last couple of centuries that democracies have managed to break loose from that, at least to some extent. And now we have this sort of fantasy world in which this shouldn't happen, in which this is senseless violence, whereas in fact it's very senseful violence. And yet we deplore it and say, oh, you shouldn't do that, and wag our fingers, and we're utterly impotent.
Your Twitter bio, for those who don't know you, your Twitter bio says that you're a medieval historian, specialist of apocalyptic millennialism, blogger on mainstream media lethal journalism, and other follies of the 21st century intelligentsia. That's a lot to cover, but let's start with this. You are writing a book about the year 2000. Why the year 2000? What is special about this moment that has inspired you to write an entire book?
Right. Well, first of all, my medieval work is on the year 1000. And there's no question in my mind that for people at the time, there was literally a countdown to the year 1000. They expected Jesus to return. There are all kinds of manifestations of that expectation. And also my work deals with the year 6000 from creation, which according to Christians was supposed to happen in the year 500. And then when it didn't happen in the year 500, they actually retargeted before they got to that 6000 to the year 801. Charlemagne is crowned on the first day of the year 6000. Nobody mentions it in the sources. When I pointed out to medieval historians, they're not interested. But I've always paid attention to these sort of big round numbers that do exercise a certain fascination. 1400 in the Muslim calendar is the year 1979 CE AD. That's the year Khomeini took over in Iran. That's the year that there was a Mahdi pretender who took the Grand Mosque in Mecca. That's the year a whole series of incidents occur as a result of that. And the Muslims have this tradition called Mujaddid, which is that every 100 years there will be a renewer. So 2000 was targeted certainly by the, what do we call them? Premillennial dispensationalists. The Christian fundamentalists believed that the rapture would happen in the year 2000. And there was a lot of preaching around it and so on. We were following it. There was a mass movement called the Promise Keepers that used a lot of that. And in fact, they had a rally, a 1 million man rally and march in Washington in 1897. And one of the speakers says, speaking of, the end of the world, said, when the apocalyptic alarm rings, do not press the snooze button. So there was a lot of this stuff. And in my own work, what I had noticed was that there was a kind of wave pattern to apocalyptic movements, an upswing of excitement and enthusiasm. Then you have the disappointment, which, for example, for Christianity would be the crucifixion of Jesus. For Islam, the death of Muhammad. And then a downslope with all kinds of weird things that happen during what I call re-entry into normal time. One of the things I noticed was that certainly for Christians, and certainly for the period of early Islam while Muhammad was still alive, the earliest period tends to be marked by philo-Judaism. They're enthused about Jews, partly because they think Jews are going to join them. They reach out to Jews. There's an interest in Jews. And then with the disappointment, one of the tendencies is what I call apocalyptic scapegoating, which is to say Jesus didn't come back because the Jews didn't convert. And embedded in this is also some cultural changes, which is when you open up to Jews, when you, instead of having your foot on their neck, you accept them as players in your culture, Jews tend to have a leavening effect. They tend to encourage economic activity, positive sum activity. I think the Jews are essentially a positive sum people. And their impact in Gentile society is to sort of heat up that society. And so for a while, that's very popular. But then, you start to get sort of unpleasant, what you might call in the modern case, the toxic wake of modernity, which is that, human rights is a great idea, but if you're on top, human rights is a threat to your freedom of action. And so over time, there tends to be a buildup of hostility to Jews, which comes out in terms of, in some cases, an explosion. For instance, the Peace of God movement, which I study in the early 11th century, led to this kind of stuff. And then in the disappointment at various points, including the Crusades, you get this explosion of anti-Judaism. So I speculated that, since the Holocaust, we had had in the West, and especially in America, the longest period and most intense period of philo-Judaism probably in the history of the religion. Let's call it 4,000 years. Take it back to Abraham. And so I speculated that perhaps the disappointment with the non-arrival of the rapture, which as a historian I was willing to predict even before it didn't happen, would lead to Christians scapegoating the apocalyptic Christians who were very philo-Judaic in their Christian Zionism, scapegoating the Jews and turning against them. So I was looking at 2000 quite carefully.
Already in the year 2000, you were looking, or when did
before
you
that,
before?
1990s.
You were looking
1990s.
ahead,
I was looking at the year 2000. In fact, I wrote a piece on the year 1000, and I showed it to my father. This was in the early 1990s, and I said, and I think we're going to have stuff in the year 2000. He said, whatever you do, don't say it out loud, because it just discredits you to think in these terms. Okay, so
Did you understate or overstate the prediction?
I was careful. I said, look, I don't know what's going to happen, but I did predict that we might have a turn towards anti-Semitism. And, I spoke to a number of Jewish leaders, including Rabbi Sachs in England, and their response was, look, everything's going great. You're completely off base. And then the Intifada hit. And then you see this wave of vicious stuff about Israelis, not Jews, but Israelis, and Israelis are clearly Jews. A wave of this stuff. And in fact, what I realized was I had called it right, but I had mistaken who would be the players. I think if Camp David had succeeded,
explain what that is, Camp David.
All right, so if Camp David, if the Oslo peace process had reached its successful conclusion at Camp David, and a Barak liberal Labor government had given back the West Bank, or most of the West Bank, and even divided Jerusalem, then it's very possible that the Christians would have turned against us. Instead, Arafat said no, started his, what's called an intifada, but in my book is the Oslo Jihad, and really the opening round of global jihad, which the next year would strike America on 9/11. So Arafat and Hamas start the war against Israel, and they had said all along, this is, in Arabic, they had said this is land for war, not land for peace. But the people who wanted to believe, ignored them, including the Israeli intelligence services, ignored these warnings that were being given, and accused the Jews who gave the warnings as being, having a Holocaust complex, and they don't trust people. Well, Arafat was not a trustworthy player, but okay. So when that broke out, what to my astonishment happened was that, I had been following since the mid-1990s global jihad as an apocalyptic movement. A graduate student at the time at Hebrew University, who's now at Rice, David Cook, told me all about this stuff and the way the Arabs, the Muslim apocalyptic thinkers had targeted 2000. Specifically, they had targeted 2000. And when I said to people they've targeted 2000, they would say to me, but that's not even their calendar. As if, therefore it can't be. So they start an apocalyptic war, and much to my utter astonishment, the left joined them. And it was the disappointed millennialism of 2000 was not the non-arrival of Jesus. It was the failure of the Oslo peace process, which I had for a while been sort of targeting or describing as soft millennialism. This is, the global community, the global civil society that's just around the corner. And when Israel and the Arabs make peace, then the whole world will be at peace, blah, blah, blah. And when it failed, like many apocalyptic believers, instead of saying we were wrong, they doubled down on what they believed and said, if only Israel had given more, if only Israel had been more forthcoming, then Arafat would have said yes. Whereas as far as I can make out, and based on my understanding of pre-modern societies, honor shame culture and stuff, there wasn't a chance in the world that Arafat was going to say yes to this.
One of the challenges of being an educator, I guide people around Israel, mostly college students, and it's probably likely that until this point in our conversation, people under a certain age do not know a single reference that you've made. So I want to try to back up a bit and try to provide some context of, for example, what was I doing in the year 2000 and how did this hit me? Because I've followed your work for a long time, and it relates to my awakening. In the year 2000, it was my first time in Israel. And I came here on a 6-week trip. And the atmosphere in July 2000, we didn't have smartphones, weren't connected to the internet, but the atmosphere when we would receive news updates from our counselors and so on, we were hearing that the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and the PLO chairman Yasser Arafat, they're meeting in Camp David, Maryland at the presidential retreat, and they're talking peace.
Right.
So this notion was that peace was going to break out. It was inevitable. Yeah. And no one was thinking about what was going to happen in a month or 2 months. So when I came back home and I saw these images on television, which we'll discuss, it was a huge contrast for what I had been told. So I had some questions, namely, one, why is this happening? Why, instead of peace, are we getting waves of suicide bombings? Right. And a related question is, well, why did people get this so wrong? Why did people not have any idea of what we were dealing with? And that led me on, a long discovery. So that's kind of where I was in 2000. Like, where were you in the summer of 2000?
So in the summer of 2000, I was in the United States. I was running an institute at Boston called the Center for Millennial Studies. We had been working on a number of things, including global warming, the rapture people, Y2K, the computer glitch that was supposed to send all of our computers into conniption fits at the moment when it switched from 1999 to 2000 and so on. And we were collecting a lot of this data and so on. And of course, following what was going on in Islam and so on. One of my daughters actually remembers that back in 1993, when the Oslo Peace Treaty was signed, she remembered hearing me say to my wife, we can go to Israel now, there's going to be peace. I changed my mind over the course of those 7 years, largely because I followed sites like Palestinian Media Watch and Memory, which translated the Arab sources into English. And there was a famous incident in 1994, just after he got his Nobel Peace Prize and gave this speech about the peace of the brave and so on and so forth. Arafat went to South Africa for Mandela's inauguration, and he visited a mosque there. And he was questioned by the Muslims in the mosque, who were mostly from India. He was questioned by the Muslims in the mosque about what he had done, and they were furious with him for making this peace treaty with Israel. And so he explained to them, look, this is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which is a treaty that Muhammad made with the Meccans for 10 years. And then 2 years later, when he was in a position of strength, he broke it and ambushed the Meccans and destroyed them and took over Mecca. So he was basically saying, look, this is a Trojan horse. And they even used that term, Trojan horse. And so why didn't anybody pay attention to this? People were so intent on the peace process. They were so committed to it that I heard a wonderful term called hopium. They were addicted to hope. I actually remember hearing an Israeli who had pushed for the evacuation of Lebanon in 2000, being interviewed in 2006 when the war broke out. And they quoted him saying, you know, if we leave, then we'll have peace with the Lebanese. And the interviewer said, so what do you think of this? And his response was, I'm proud that I had hope. So, okay. So I think that this hope, which is part of positive sum relations, it's very Jewish and so on, was so strong that people didn't want to hear. They believed that when the chips were down, Arafat would want to be approved of by the big boys, by Clinton, by the Europeans, and everybody was giving him approval, and he lapped it up, and they figured. But they had no idea that his commitment to Arab honor shame culture was vastly more powerful. So he said no. And then 2 months later, not even 2 months later, it was in July, he said no, and in September, the Intifada broke out.
So you've said your background as a medievalist historian gave you the tools to understand not just what happened, but why people got it wrong. Can you just explain for a moment what exactly is a medieval historian? What makes a historian a historian? What is your professional training that gives you these tools? What is the field of medieval
history more or less covers the period from the fall of Rome, about 500 CE, to the Renaissance around 1500. I mean, you can monkey with the numbers either way, but, you know, sort of 6th century to 16th century. And if you want a good idea of the sort of mentality at work in the Middle Ages, you know, watch Game of Thrones. That's really very powerfully evocative of the kinds of thinking involved. And basically, as I said earlier, it's like zero-sum thinking. I can only win if you lose. It's rule or be ruled. If I don't dominate you, you'll dominate me. And therefore, in self-defense, I have to dominate you. So, and, you know, one of the characteristics of an honor-shame culture is you're not a man unless you've killed another man. Schumpeter apparently said that capitalism was the first system in which you could be a man without killing another man. I actually think Judaism was, but both of them are significant because they're the exception to the rule. And so as a result, you know, when I would teach medieval history, I'd have to get my students to leave what I came to understand was their cognitive egocentrism, which is their tendency to project their mindset onto others. So, for example, when 9/11 hit, there was a woman who was in Beirut who was stunned to see not just the Muslims celebrating, but the Christian Arabs celebrating. She wrote a piece for it in the Wall Street Journal. And at that time, it was already online, and there were comments. And one person wrote, I don't believe this because people aren't like that. You know, so it's like, or I had a student in my class who said, I don't think Goldhagen is a good historian because he describes the German police battalion that started the extermination of the Jews by going house to house and taking them out into the woods and shooting them point blank as sadistic. And I said, what's wrong with that? She said, well, I think it dehumanizes them. And I said, sadism, you know about sadism in animals? I mean, sadism is a human. So there's this deep confusion between human and humane. And we think that people, not only do we think that people are humane, but if you say they're not, you're accused of racism.
How did medieval history become your academic focus? Where did that begin for you?
It actually began in India in January of 1969.
Wow.
I was on a tour, a student year abroad called the International Honors Program, which is still running. And we went to 7 different countries to study modernization. So we started in Japan, then we studied China from Hong Kong, then we went to India, Israel, Turkey, Yugoslavia, Russia, Sweden. And so we had a mix of modern countries like Japan and Sweden, and sort of in-between countries like Yugoslavia and Turkey and Israel, and what were then, we were starting not to call them backwards, but underdeveloped countries like India. So I'm in India, and we're being lectured by famous Indian historian Ramala Tapar. And she explains to us that the reason why Indians, this is at a point where India had not come anywhere near starting its economic development, which has been quite remarkable in the last couple of decades. But at the time, India was sort of the bottom of the bottom. And she said, look, if you believe in reincarnation, then whatever you are in this world, if you're poor and miserable and crippled, you deserve it because of how you behaved in your last incarnation. And so there's no reason to change the world. The world is just. And however it manifests, whatever injustices are actually just punishments for previous behavior. And I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking, but this is the exact opposite of the messianic impulse, which is that the world is pervaded by evil and that shortly everything is going to change. So that's when I first began. I mean, I have a small piece of backstory. My father was an economic historian of the Industrial Revolution. And so I grew up in a household where the question, one of the main questions was, why the West? Why did the West develop a economic and technological and scientific culture that most cultures, even when they have the blueprint, can't follow? How is it that the West generated this blueprint? And so I went back to the Middle Ages, partly to sort of do the prehistory of my father's work. You could say one-up him a little and say, it begins in the Middle Ages. And, even at the time, medieval historians considered the 11th century sort of a turning point. And so I began to think, year 1000 plays in that turning point, and everything that I found subsequently, you can say that I found what I wanted to, but I sure found a lot of stuff to indicate that, yes, there was a wave of messianic expectation, what I call demotic religiosity, which is based on principles of equality before the law, dignity of manual labor. Each individual has a direct relationship with God. A huge injection of that in European society at the time. And, the 11th century is the century of the urban and rural communes, of the economic and agricultural revolution, of the church reform, actually a revolution, and of the Crusades. So it's the newest of centuries.
And before that, where were you born and raised, and what was your academic path to getting to be a medieval historian?
Well, yeah, medieval historian was really a latecomer. I went to college wanting to be an economist, but I really didn't like economics, and I didn't like the pretension to be a science. And then the 60s hit.
Where were you growing up? Where were you at this time?
So my elementary school and junior high school years were in Berkeley, California, public school. And then I went to a private school in Boston when we moved to Cambridge in 64. And then I went to Harvard. So I was in Harvard 67 to 71, which was, talk about hitting the sweet spot or catching the big wave. And that was a millennial movement. I mean, I really felt it. It traversed the world. It was very powerful. Woodstock generation. And so I knew what it was like to be enthused by that. But I also, observed the kinds of things that meant that it would fail. That kind of enthusiasm can't sustain itself. So, so while I was at Harvard, I got interested in Buddhism. I got interested in meditation. Baba Ramdas, Richard Alpert. After that, I did a year, and by the end, I was clear that the Middle Ages was what I wanted to study. I went to Paris for a year, studied with Jacques Le Goff and Georges Duby and Alphonse Dupron. And then I went down to the Pyrenees and lived in what's called a métairie, which is sort of, a house in the hills above a village, about 800 meters above a village in the Pyrenees Mountains, and ended up spending about a year and a half there doing yoga, meditating, growing vegetables, chopping wood.
I imagine as a medieval historian, you have to be able to read primary source documents in some type of medieval French.
Latin.
Also.
Most of the documents are in Latin. And one of the interesting things about that is, there are two things. One is that because Latin is not anybody's mother tongue, it takes a fair amount of effort to learn it. And, up until quite recently, the belief was widespread that if you're not beaten, you can't learn Latin. If your teacher doesn't beat you, you won't learn Latin. And the proof is that now that we don't beat students, Latin is virtually disappearing from the schools.
Correlation, causation.
Or whatever. But the other aspect of it is that medievalists, I was living like a medieval person. I didn't have phone. I didn't have anything up there. There was no electricity. There was no running water. I was living, and in fact, at one point, they tried to kick us out, and we had to get permis de séjour, visas to stay. And Le Goff wrote a letter for me saying that I was experimenting, living as a medieval hermit. So that was really valuable. But the point is that the people who spend their time learning Latin have very little sense of what it's like to live under those conditions. So there's a sort of medieval historians tend to be very intellectual and focus on intellect, and their social history is not as good. And in fact, at one point, somebody accused me in my work of being a Marxist, which I'm not. And I said to a friend who was an ex-Trotskyite, is my work Marxist? And she said, no, don't be ridiculous. I said, why do you say that? She says, because you think peasants think. Whereas, both the prejudice of medieval aristocrats and intellectuals, those who wrote and left us the record, and of modern historians is that, the peasants are like dumb oxen. They're not, And I'm thinking, when I think of these messianic movements in this peace of God, the peasant participants, I can imagine what they're thinking. My colleagues don't seem to do very well.
So for much of your academic career, you're focused on history, medieval period, France. Where was Israel fitting into your life at this time? Was it a place you visited? Was it a place you had a connection with? What was that situation?
So I was 18 in the summer of 1967. And apparently people say that you could hear the shout that I let out when the news of the 67 victory came, because, at the time, and I didn't realize that I'd later be dealing with this, the Boston Globe had been running Arab claims of destroying the Israeli Air Force for days. And then all of a sudden, so I came here in the summer of 67, worked on a kibbutz, came back I left the place I was living in the Pyrenees to come back after the 73 war and spent a year here. So it was really part of my identity. And I had planned to come back. And I spent the year 94, 95 here, a wonderful time. I've lost a lot of friends from then because we were all very positive about peace. And when I started saying no, And certainly after 2000, I lost a lot of friends. But yeah, no, I've always loved this country.
So let's come back to that period. You were here 94, 95, which is what people may say is the peak of the peace process, the hopium, the idea that this long-running Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab conflict would come to an end with some negotiated settlement.
Right.
And in the year 2000, this literally
blew up in our
faces. And you began to take another look at what was going on in the 90s and how people reacted in 2000 to the fact that peace didn't happen, both in Israeli society, American policy, and also the media. I mean, what were some of the things that you saw in the year 2000 that you felt other people were not paying enough attention to?
Well, first of all, it wasn't just in the year 2000. I mean, already when I was here, 94 was the time that the suicide terror attacks from Hamas started. And I remember Rabin coming on the radio after these attacks and, forgive me for saying this, but you could hear that he had been drinking. And in his deep, gravelly voice talking about, sacrifices for peace and stuff. And I remember thinking, I'm not sure that's the right response. And then the Hudaybiyah speech of 94, that happened while I was here, and I tried to talk to people, and they just weren't interested. They really weren't interested in it, in discussing it. So already by the time the thing failed, I still held out hope because everybody else did, and, it's sort of like, I guess, hope is really powerful. But then when it exploded, I remember seeing the picture of Mohammed al-Dura, and that was the end of it. I mean, trying to explain to people that the Palestinians were responsible for the failure of the peace process was difficult enough. And then when the images of this little boy behind the barrel at Netzerim Junction.
Can you tell that story? Who was Mohammed al-Dura, and how did you first encounter?
So Mohammed al-Dura was this 12-year-old boy who was allegedly shot in his father's arms at Netzerim Junction, which is right in the center of the Gaza Strip, and by the Israelis in cold blood, according to the Palestinian photographer, cameraman who shot it. It hit like a nuclear bomb of cognitive warfare. It just exploded in the news, and it turned everyone against Israel, including Jews. I mean, it was a horrifying thing. And, to some extent, Jews were faced with the problem of, do we believe the media? In which case, Israel has behaved exactly as the Arabs have been claiming all along, that we're a bunch of child murderers. Or do we have faith in the IDF, and do we question the media? And questioning the media was not easy then. Now nobody trusts the media, but back then there was huge trust in the media. For me, it was... initially I accepted it. I didn't know what was going on. I mean, there were two versions. He was caught in a crossfire and it was accidental. And then there was the lethal blood libel version that they targeted him in cold blood, which is what the Palestinian photographer said. And what this Israeli-French journalist for France 2, who was a major figure at the time, he was the first one to run the story. And I think if he had not run the story, it probably wouldn't have run. The story is that Talal went to the guy at CNN with this story, and he said no, because the footage is pathetic. But Anderlin was very talented. He turned the footage into a narrative, and the narrative was, here is Mohammed al-Dura and his father the target of fire coming from the Israeli position, which was not true. It wasn't fire coming from the Israeli position, and he wasn't the target of it. But it had a devastating impact, which I only subsequently learned about. And then in 2003, I went to France, and part of what I was doing was I was on the board of the American Jewish Committee at the time, and I was on their media committee, and we were trying to understand why had the media turned against Israel, because it really did turn against Israel. I mean, 4 days after the al-Dura piece appeared, there was already a lot of shooting and Palestinians were claiming deaths up, down, and sideways. Nobody was verifying them. Newspapers were running, 12 Israelis and 436 Palestinians killed. And that was at the end of every article. Every article would end with that tally. And Chirac said to Barak, who was there, you can't expect the world to believe that the Palestinians started this. Look how much they're suffering, which is just to misunderstand the mentality of we will sacrifice our people in order to get at you. And that was just beyond the ken of Westerners. So then I went in 2003 and I saw the footage for the first time. I consulted with a fellow named Gérard Hubert, who had written the first book about this, and an American expatriate living in Paris, a good friend still, Nidra Polar, who took me to see him, and we talked about it and so on. And as soon as I saw the footage, it was clear to me that this wasn't for real. It was absurd. It was a cheap fake, and yet the belief in it was so strong that you could not get people to even imagine that it was a fake, or that the media would be foolish enough to run so volatile a fake.
So this boy, Mohammed al-Dura, the story was that initially he was killed in cold blood by Israeli forces. And as I was looking into this incident, it was more than 20 years ago. I wanted to refresh my memory. I know you played a big role in, let's say, second guessing the story. Trying. And I thought you were the first one to cast doubt because somehow you saw extra footage that didn't make it into the media. And I realized, you had mentioned a long article published in The Atlantic, which I'm looking at right now, published by James Fallows, a well-known journalist. And he wrote a long essay called Who Shot Mohammed al-Dura, and gives a fairly fair hearing based on the information that he had at the time about the serious skepticism about the truth of these claims. And so how did you end up being able to see this footage that didn't air? How did you come across all this extra B-roll footage, and what did you see, and how did you discover it?
So probably the most important thing to mention is an Israeli physicist named Nachum Shachaf, who unfortunately had tendencies towards conspiracy theory, particularly interestingly enough about Rabin's death, which put him in dubious company as far as the Israeli mainstream was concerned. But he looked at the footage and immediately suspected something. And Yom Tov Samia, who was in charge of the Southern Command, put him unofficially in charge of an investigation. And he immediately wrote to all the media companies that were there for their footage of what had happened that day. The only people who responded were Reuters, and they sent 2 hours of footage. And I saw that footage in his studio, and that's when I realized that faking was going on all the time. In fact, it's not just that kids were pretending to be injured and, people would pick them up and run them to an ambulance and throw them in the back, which was sort of the meat and potatoes of the fakes, but there were actual scenes that were set, and there were actors, and there were directors, and even makeup artists, and so on. It was really quite an elaborate affair.
And the purpose of this is so that they would provide this type of footage to foreign journalists,
Yes,
so they could kind of run it in the background as they're just talking about the day's events.
Exactly. So it was sort of B-roll. As I'm describing the clashes between Israel, the IDF, and the Palestinians, and there are two basic images. One is the brave Palestinian firing at the Israelis, and the other is the Palestinian victim. And some of the cases were like comic. They were so obvious. And then I got a chance to see the footage that Talal Abu Rahmeh shot, who was the one who shot the footage of al-Dura and sold it to his boss, Charles Anderlin, in France 2. So I went to France 2 Studios. This was in October of 2003, and I saw the footage, and sure enough, it was the same as the stuff with the Reuters footage, fakes. One particularly funny fake in which a big fat guy grabs his leg as if he's been shot in the leg and looks around for somebody to, carry him to the ambulance, and they're only little kids, and he shoos them away and walks away without a limp. And at that point, the other guy who was watching it with us, a cameraman, Charles Anderlin's Israeli cameraman, who had never seen the footage and joined us because he wanted to see it, laughed. And I said, "What are you laughing?" He said, "Because it seems fake." I said, "All this stuff seems fake." And Anderlin says, and I want to preface this by saying this is such an Orientalist thing to say. Anderlin says,
What's Orientalist? So,
well, that's Said's complaint that the West sort of stereotypes the Arab world, and demeans them, and it's disgusting, and it's a form of racism. Anderlin says to me, "Oh, they do that all the time. It's a cultural thing." I said, "Look, if they do that all the time, how can you tell me that they didn't fake the al-Dura stuff?" To which he responded, "They're not good enough to fool me." So as I walked out, it was sort of like the second piece of the puzzle. The first part, that the Palestinians faked it, I learned from Shahaf. But the attitude of Western media, that this was perfectly acceptable, and I'll just use the most convincing sight bites that I can pull out, I realized it was an industry, and a successful industry. And that's when I coined the term Pallywood.
And what did you do with this Pallywood? You created a documentary?
I did a documentary. And in fact, I made the documentary on Pallywood before I made my documentary on al-Dura, because when I was talking to people about the al-Dura case, and I'd say, look, there are 5 possibilities. The Israelis on purpose, the Israelis by accident, the Palestinians by accident, the Palestinians on purpose, and 5, and I'd stop and wait for them. Nobody came up with staged. It was just unthinkable. And you'll note that in the title of
James Fallows
thing, "Who Shot Mohammed al-Dura?" And both he and a German documentary maker named Esther Shapira studied the stuff with Shahaf and came up with a documentary and this article. And her thing was 3 bullets and a dead child. In other words, they all bought the idea that al-Dura had been shot. Whereas the last time we see him, and this is footage that Anderlin cut, saying that it was the death throes of the child and it was too much for people to bear, basically has the boy lifting up his elbow and looking out at the camera and then slowly putting his elbow down, which is not how you behave if you've been shot in the stomach and you're bleeding out. So the last time we see him on camera, he's alive. And there's no evidence other than a funeral in which the kid who's on the funeral bier is not Mohammed al-Dura, according to facial studies of photographs and stuff. There's no evidence that he was shot, and yet that was the most unthinkable thing. So first I wanted to establish Pallywood, that there is this faking going on and that the Western media is duped to it. Then I did al-Dura, and then I did what I think is the most important movie. I think it got the least attention, called Icon of Hatred, in which I go into the impact that this footage had. And the only thing even remotely similar is the Jenin massacre story.
So the idea was that Mohammed al-Dura became a symbol, an image, an icon. This was already in the fall of 2000, before 9/11.
Right.
And bin Laden was citing Mohammed al-Dura.
Bin Laden used it. It was like the centerpiece of his recruiting video for global jihad. I know of an ex-radical Muslim who was recruited in England in the aughts, the first decade of the 2000s, in which he remembers the cover of the videotape was the picture of Muhammad al-Dura. But it wasn't just that the Arab world jumped on this and saw it, and bin Laden used it as a justification for attacking America. But the Europeans and the progressives saw it as, at the time I said, a get out of Holocaust guilt-free card. There was a French woman, an anchor, news anchor, not particularly left, who said this picture replaces the picture of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. So for me, that's the sort of quintessential image of the disorientation that struck Western elites in the year 2000. Here you have a woman saying that a dubious picture of a boy, most probably, if killed in a crossfire, has erased and replaced an image of a boy who symbolizes the deliberate murder of over 1 million children. Now, and yet she really spoke for a lot of people. And that image is at the core of what is now widespread, which is this notion of Holocaust inversion, that the Israelis are committing genocide against the Palestinians, and that they are the new Nazis and the Palestinians are the new Jews. Whereas there's no group on the planet as openly admiring of the Nazis than the Palestinian leadership, secular and religious. So it's hard to get it more wrong than what happened then, and we've been paying the price ever since. This is the first massive and still uncorrected wave of fake news. Not fake news coming from bots in Russia. Fake news permeating the mainstream legacy media. Disaster.
So you've been following media coverage of Israel for a very long time, with a special focus after the year 2000, Mohammed al-Dura, how this became a symbol. Would you say that social media has made things better or worse?
Much worse.
What trends do you see in terms of how social media affects people's perception of reality here in Israel?
Well, first of all, I just want to mention, I just recently saw this. I haven't read the article yet, but Gabi Wyman, who also was involved in the al-Dura affair, Gabi Wyman has just done a piece on anti-Semitism in TikTok. That's apparently terrifying. What social media has done is to energize, one might even say sort of social media is legacy media on crack, energize what some people might call moral panics, what other people would call sort of moral outrage. The ability to chase somebody out of, to make them pariahs, has immensely increased with the development of, there's a book by John Ronston called So You've Been Shamed. And he came out with it maybe a decade ago. And it's only gotten worse. And so we're looking, for instance, today in academia, but also I think in journalism, you can't even defend Zionism. It's like, that's a taboo subject. in academia, in Middle Eastern studies, and so on. So in 2021, when you had the latest outbreak of violence between Israel and Gaza, you had whole, hundreds of journalists insisting that the media adopt the Palestinian narrative, adopt their language, adopt their, Israel occupation army and stuff. And you had academics, including Jewish academics and Jewish studies, coming out with statements in support of the Palestinians in which the role of Hamas and the role of terror is completely expunged from the record, and B, all sorts of claims are made about what Israel's done that are empirically inaccurate. So we are looking at, first of all, an anti-intellectual movement that has taken over, and literally a collapse of the information professions in terms of their ability to give the public accurate and relevant information. In 2000, shortly after al-Dura, there was the Ramallah lynching. Unbelievably vicious.
Explain what that was.
Two Israeli reservists, Russians, took the wrong turn and ended up in Ramallah. They were taken into custody by the police. As soon as word got out that there were two Israelis, the mob came in, literally killed them with their fists, their bare hands, threw their bodies out the window, tore them apart, and dragged burning parts of their body through the city. And one of the pro-Palestinian photographers who was there and got beat up and his camera destroyed, lest the images get out, said, I'll have nightmares all my life. I've been all over the world. I've seen terrible things. I've never seen hatred like this. Okay. The next day, on Palestinian TV, a Palestinian PA-appointed Sheikh Halabaya gets up and says in the mosque in Gaza, these are the Jews, whether Labor or Likud, the Jews are Jews, kill them wherever you see them, have no mercy, massacre them everywhere in the world. 2 weeks later, William Orm, journalist for the New York Times, does a piece in which the Israelis are saying, look, the Palestinians are engaging in genocidal hate speech. And, their radio is the equivalent of the Radio Mille Collines, which was the source of the Rwandan genocide. They were the ones who were pumping up people and telling them to go out and kill the Tutsis. And so he does a piece in which he has the Palestinian spokesman say, the Israelis, whatever we say, they consider incitement. And then he has the Israeli saying, no, this is really incitement. Here's an example. So the only example he gives is this speech by Halabaya in which he quotes, Labor, Likud, they're all Jews, they're all the same, ... close quote. So he excised the genocidal speech. So that's why, it's not only inaccurate, it doesn't even give you relevant information. To this day, readers of the New York Times, listeners of NPR, viewers of the BBC and CNN do not know what kind of unbelievably vicious Nazi-like genocidal hatred is aired in the Palestinian public sphere constantly. And so, even when people talk about, well, what about incitement from the Palestinians, they don't go into any of the details. They don't show any of this. And so people think, Israelis, why are they so mean to the Palestinians?
One of the common questions that I get when I'm guiding or giving lectures is, what's something that we should know that we don't? Like, what are we missing from all the program, from all this itinerary? And I always give the answer that if you want to understand the Israeli attitude, as wide a definition as I can give for this term, you have to understand how Israelis experienced the year 2000, 2001, and 2002, because it didn't carry over to let's say the way the Americans understood it or
Right.
the Europeans understood it, but the Israelis understood it and experienced it in such a different
Right.
way that shaped their politics until today.
Right.
And anyone who wants to, let's say, come help or at least understand what are the views that are motivating you if you don't understand these years. And I think Israelis have in many ways wiped them out of our memory because they're so traumatic. There are not so many books and movies about this time. It's something we just kind of want to push behind us. But when Israelis go to vote, one of the big questions, what makes an Israeli decide? Vote for this person, vote for that person. And I think let's say the parties, factions that are perceived as being responsible for getting the year 2000 wrong are no longer an electoral force in Israel.
Absolutely.
And yet Americans, Europeans, and so on sort of treat this faction as, well, they should be the mainstream. Why not?
Right.
And it totally discounts the Israeli experience. So what you've tried to do by continue talking about this is to educate people that have missed a major point, because we talk about 48 and 67 and 73, and everyone misses 2000, 2001, 2002. Who do you think has learned the lessons of 2000 maybe correctly, and who has still failed to get the memo?
Well, I want to say one point about what you said, which is, in fact, yes, I wrote my book, and at the end I say, if you want to understand how we got as crazy as we did, and I think most people agree we're pretty crazy now, and by we, I don't mean just Israelis, I mean the West, you got to start with 2000. You got to start with this radical misreading. It was the opening round of global jihad, and it was viewed specifically as a liberation movement against Israeli imperialism, rather than Muslim imperialism attacking the most immediate democratic target they had. And that misreading has led to what I call Y2K mind, Y2K being the year 2000, which is the belief that when jihadis attack a democracy, blame the democracy, which is what happened to a significant extent in the United States, not immediately, but over time, it has become the dominant voice that somehow, well, there were people right away who said, America's roosters, karma coming home to roost, and so on. So I think that you're absolutely right that 2000 is a crucial turning point that people have not dealt with and don't want to deal with. It's a very painful story, and every time al-Dura comes back, there are people, Israelis, who say, let's not go into it. That's a loser. Don't go there. I think you got to dive into it. But who's got it right and who's got it wrong? I remember a conversation with a journalist for the Wall Street Journal, a friend of my daughter's, who then was in Dover Tzahal. And
the IDF spokesperson's unit. For those who
the IDF spokesperson's
don't know Hebrew.
Unit. And he was saying, it's just too bad that the Israelis turned to the right just because of suicide.
It's a phrase we often saw in the media, Israel's rightward shift, again and again and again.
Right. In the meantime, not only are the Europeans and the Americans, liberals and progressives, telling us that we've gone wrong, but they insist on ignoring the very things that we felt up close and very painfully in the course of that time. So who's got it right? That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think Nidra Polar does.
Who is that?
Nidra Polar is a journalist in France. She writes in English. She writes for the English Review. She used to write for The Sun, which is now coming back. Look, it's really hard because even the people who get it, it's hard to get behind them. I mean, to some extent, Trump got it. And it was sort of bizarre when he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. And, people were predicting this apocalyptic eruption in the Arab world, the Muslim world over it, and so on and so forth. And it turned out not to be. what was ironic was here's this crazy guy who's got it more right than all of these specialists.
Well, when you look at the Israeli electorate, for example, today,
Right.
we have a government today that if you would have told me a year ago that this would have been the government,
Right.
I would think you're just doing some academic exercise to
Right.
come up with the
Right.
math to get
Right.
to a majority.
Right.
But it seems that when Israelis are going to vote now, or when they look to a government to form a
Right.
coalition,
Right.
the central issue is no longer, let's say, about the response to the Intifada or the failure of the peace process, because it has seeped through most of the electorate who kind of came to the same
Right.
conclusion one way or
Right.
another. So the left-right dividing line that we're used to is no longer relevant, and there
Right.
are other ways to divide and build coalitions and so
Right.
on. So
Right.
now when we see a prime minister who comes from a solidly right-wing camp,
Right.
Meretz and Labor, who are the remnants of the Oslo peace process
Right.
camp, sitting in the same government with a conservative
Right.
Arab Muslim party, while at the same time kind of maintaining the security status quo. There have been no
Right.
major moves since the
Right.
withdrawal from Gaza, no
Right.
major withdrawals, peace
Right.
process, whatever. And the Labor Party, the Meretz left-wing party, is not making this kind of demand that we need to
Right.
get back to this, because
Yes.
clearly the voters are seeing a different reality. So perhaps in a way, the Israeli electorate has it right because it's in front of their nose over time. But the others who are looking on, we mentioned the Europeans in the
Right.
beginning of our conversation, the Americans, they're in a way projecting their own local politics onto
Yes.
us and ignoring
Yes.
the experiences we've had and the conclusions we've drawn. And it may be convenient for them, but it ultimately misses the reality.
It not only misses the reality. I mean, one of the things that I learned, Yossi Cooper-Wasser, who gets it, a retired general, Israeli general, coined the term lethal journalism. Nidra Polar coined the term lethal narrative. A lethal narrative is like al-Dura. It's a story that even if you can prove it wrong, has done damage. There's no, it's a lethal story. It incites hatred of the people that it's told about. And lethal journalism, I define as lethal journalism is reporting one side's war propaganda as news. And what I began to realize in the Jenin affair as the sort of culmination of this is that this is not just lethal journalism against, in this case, Israel. It's own goal journalism. In other words, you're not just reporting one side against another side in a distant fight. You're reporting your enemy's propaganda as news. So a lot of the attitude of the West towards Israel has been own goal. They've literally damaged their own position by taking the stance they do. And in Jenin, this report, Jenin was the suicide capital of the Palestinian Authority.
This was in 2002, I believe. There'd been a wave of suicide bombings.
Wave of suicide bombings.
And Israel finally decides,
Right.
okay, we can't practice restraint anymore.
Right.
So one of the options that Israel could have had is to use its air force to
Absolutely.
bomb
They could have just
the
bombed,
focal point of this suicide bombers.
given people a week to get out, and then just
kind of
bombed
had a
the hell out of
perimeter
it.
and said,
Right.
you got to come through. And instead, the Israel Defense Forces went in these narrow alleyways of Jenin and fought house to house.
Lost 23
lost
men.
23 Israeli soldiers. And as this is going on, the Palestinians accuse Israel of carrying out a
Blaming
massacre. I don't remember the number, was 500,
500,
1,000.
1,000, 1,500, and describing it, literally taking it out of descriptions of the Nazis,
Right.
lining people up into mass graves.
And beyond that, so the lethal journalism part would be, let's say, writing a headline, Israel massacres Palestinians in Jenin, comma, Palestinians say. Is this
Right.
the type of
Right.
reporting that you're talking about, where they amplify a claim as if it's news, when
Right.
it turns out that it was a very serious military battle, no
was
kind of
the
massacre,
opposite.
and they were just going on CNN and saying
Exactly.
massacre.
And it was literally the opposite. In other words, in the history of urban warfare, in which the enemy has hidden behind civilians and used civilians as shields to protect themselves, there has never been a 3 combatant to 1 civilian ratio
Casualty.
in the history of urban warfare, and that's what it was this time. So the Israeli army is behaving on levels of moral concern for the lives of enemy civilians as never before seen, and yet the press is accusing them and circulating stories of them massacring the Palestinians. And at the height of this, there were a series of demonstrations that, her name escapes me right now, great Italian journalists came out with a cri de coeur about how the anti-Semitism. In the meantime, there were models in European cities who were demonstrating wearing nothing but mock suicide belts to show their solidarity with the Palestinians. And I don't know if you've seen the movie Independence Day, but they
Will
got
Smith.
these flying saucers over cities, and in one scene on the rooftop, there are these hippies dancing and saying, "Welcome, welcome, welcome," and then the bottom of the ship opens up and zaps them. Now, in the movie, they couldn't know what was in the mind of those aliens, but anybody who wanted to could know what was in the minds of these suicide bombers, and yet here they are celebrating them in cities that within 2 or 3 years are going to be the targets of suicide bombers. That's when I realized it's not just lethal journalism, it's own goal journalism. You're reporting your enemy's propaganda as news. You can't get stupider, which is why the original title of my book was "They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid." But my daughter said I shouldn't insult my readership. So now I'm thinking of calling it Disorientations.
So I want to ask you about a topic that perhaps underlies everything that we've discussed so far, whether it's your studies of medieval history, the year 2000, the reaction to it, Israel, and that is the subject of Jews, of the Jewish people. Where do you see the Jewish people fitting into what you have studied and the conclusions you have drawn and the place of Jews, not just in Israel, but in the Western civilization? And how does that affect the way that people interpret history? Yeah. It's a very small question, I know.
Small question. Fortunately, being an opinionated person, I have an answer. I once had a very interesting conversation with Professor Aumann, who got the Nobel Prize for his work in game theory. And I said, have you or any of your colleagues worked on the emotional dimensions of game theory? And being a mathematician, he looked at his wife and said, we've never done that. It turns out that, game theory, the idea of non-zero sum, positive sum, zero sum, negative sum, which is the game the Palestinians play, can be mathematicized. But I work on the emotional dimension of it. And, some of the key emotions involved in zero-sum thinking are things like envy. If you have something, or if you have success that I don't have, I feel diminished. Schadenfreude, I take pleasure in your suffering and pain. I think we'll get back to that in a moment about Jews. Schadenfreude, revenge, the desire to take revenge, and what Augustine called libido dominandi, the desire or the lust to dominate. All of these things are zero-sum mindsets. And the mindset for positive sum is a lot harder. It's got to do with forgiveness. It's got to do with generosity of spirit. If you're successful, good for you. Your success doesn't necessarily diminish me. Generosity, if you will, turning negative or zero-sum envy, I want to destroy that which I envy, into constructive envy, which is if you've succeeded, then maybe I can succeed and do the same thing or do something else. And so in focusing on this, I began to realize that a great deal of the biblical legislation, including legislating emotions like thou shalt not covet, which is a pretty weird thing to demand people to do, are in fact positive sum emotions. So in my reading, what the Jews see themselves as, somebody put it nicely, God may have chosen the Jewish people, but the Jews are a choosing people. The Jewish people see themselves as commanded by God to pursue positive sum relations, which calls for trust, it calls for vulnerability, it calls for all kinds of emotional and actual stances, relational stances that put you in a very vulnerable position. And by and large, the history of anti-Semitism is people taking advantage of our vulnerabilities. We're very small people. If you look at what's going on with Russia today, Russia's a 500-pound gorilla and China's a 1,000-pound gorilla. And we're, a 50-pound gorilla, and people have no hesitation to pick on us. So I think that, if you look at the Jews as a chosen people, God says, in choosing Abraham, he says, through you all the nations of the world will be blessed. That's really quite extraordinary. In other words, our chosenness is fulfilled when others are blessed. The zero-sum chosen people who take their chosenness as we're better than everybody else and our chosenness gives us sort of license to dominate them, project that idea of chosenness onto us, so that for them, chosenness is a privilege. And who the hell do we think we are that we're privileged? Whereas for us, it's a responsibility and even a burden. So I think that one of the ways to understand both how much Jews are value added to the societies that they live in terms of the generation of positive sum relations, which has a lot to do with economic development. On the one hand, and the victims of sort of the hostility of people is more or less the story. And since 2000, what struck me about the attitude towards this lethal journalism was that there was an almost insatiable appetite on the part not just of Westerners, but progressives in particular. Progressives loved stories of Jews behaving badly. And I thought, this is a kind of moral schadenfreude. They're just delighted to hear bad news about Jews and saying, oh, now you've lost the moral high ground, as if you can lose the moral high ground to people who admire Nazis and send their kids out to blow themselves up amongst your civilians. And then I realized we haven't lost the moral high ground to the Palestinians. We've lost the moral high ground to these moral Europeans who are just delighting in bad news about us and thinking that they're great. And I think that, ultimately, that's the story. Now, the worst part of the story is the Jews who internalize the hostility of the Gentiles and think that somehow they look good by debasing their people, not themselves. They elevate themselves by debasing their people in the eyes of enemies. It's insane.
It's interesting what you said about progressives. If you speak to progressives, they may define themselves in opposition to what's the opposite of progressive, perhaps conservative, the old institutions, right. Christianity, the church, racism, religion. Right. And it sounds like you're defining them in a way that is not necessarily the opposite of what came before them in this right. religious tradition that they broke with, but in some ways a continuation of certain attitudes. Is that how you see what's going on?
Yeah, I call it secular supersessionism. In other words, supersessionism is the belief starts with the Christians. The Muslims adopt it for their own purposes, which says that we sit on top of, we are superior to the monotheism that came before us. For the Christians, it's the Jews. For the Muslims, it's the Christians and the Jews. But the key to supersessionism is the belief that you replace the people who came before you because you are so vastly superior to them that they're no longer needed. And so you get these sort of replacement narratives in which the Christians are the new chosen people. Now, normally we think of that as a religious belief, but I think that already in the Enlightenment, and certainly today, what you see is a sort of the progressive left believes that they are the moral leaders of humanity. The green, we're going to save the planet from the greed of the capitalists and from the global warming that greed has brought on. We're going to save the planet from racism, et cetera, et cetera. We are the cutting edge of morality. And therefore, we find the very existence of people who claim to have a moral message for mankind to be unbearable. And we delight in seeing them in the mud. And the Palestinians love to throw mud. And so in the eyes of the Gentiles, the progressives, it sticks. Jenin sticks. They think it was a massacre. It was the opposite. To realize that it was the opposite would be so hard for progressives that, on some level, this is a deadly disease.
So when we speak about the place of Jews in the world and how they fit, we have to also discuss the phenomenon of opposition to Jews, which we give the term anti-Semitism. If you're paying attention to the conversations on social media in America, not just about defining Jews, but also defining the opposition to Jews, and people have a tremendous amount of trouble doing both of these things and identifying what is anti-Semitism, how do you identify it, how do you define it?
Right.
There have been organizations that have come up with definitions, the International Holocaust Remembrance definition, which has been adopted by various bodies. Right. Everyone's trying to define or say this is, this isn't. How do you look at this concept of opposition to Jews? What label do you give it? How do you identify it? And where does it fit into what's going on?
Well, so first of all, I think we should reserve the term anti-Semitism for the really nasty stuff, what I call exterminationist Jew hatred. So the Crusaders, who were so vicious that Jews preferred to slit their own throats and their children's throats rather than fall into the hands of the Crusaders. That's exterminationist anti-Semitism. The Nazis, obviously. The jihadis, alas. I think that a lady who doesn't want to rent her apartment to Jews, who dislikes Jews, you can call her anti-Jewish, whatever you want. It's not anti-Semitism. And I think we should be very careful. Whoopi Goldberg is not an anti-Semite. The Tennessee lawyers who use the term Jewing down, okay, it's not pleasant, but we have so inflated the meaning of anti-Semitism and the meaning of racism that anything, any kind of prejudice is automatically labeled by a term that really should be considered very carefully and applied only in certain really serious cases. So, for example, many Europeans don't like the Jews. That's not the same as saying we've got to exterminate these people or we will be exterminated, which is what the jihadis are saying. Starting in 2000, the image I used was the Europeans are sipping the wine of anti-Judaism while having an open bar on the hard stuff for the Muslims. They were feeding Muslim hatred of Jews. So I think it's very important not to go after every expression. Personally, I think people, human beings, have likes and dislikes. You've got a right to like or dislike. If people don't like Jews, I understand it. There's a joke about a guy who converts to Judaism and he calls up he converts to Catholicism and he calls up his wife and she yells at him. He calls up his son, he yells at him, and his daughter, and he turns around and says, gee, I've only been Christian for 15 minutes already. I'm turning into an anti-Semite. I mean, I understand that, Jews they're pushy, they're loud, they're critical, they're self-critical, they're whatever. I can understand people not liking Jews. They got a right to not like Jews. The stuff that's circulating now, let's take the Amnesty International report. What you've got there is what I see as the core of Jew hatred, which is the projection of malevolence. In other words, they've documented a bunch of things that the Israeli government has done that has disadvantaged primarily Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, not Arabs in Israel. Instead of even allowing the possibility that these are measures that are taken in self-defense against a very hostile enemy, goes back to the non-reporting of the genocidal hatreds, it is systematically seen as a Jewish plan from the beginning to dominate and crush the Palestinians. That projection of malice, of malevolence onto the Jews is, I think, at the core of the really corrosive Judeophobia that we have to fight. And again, it goes back to what I was saying about chosenness. If you believe that your chosenness gives you the right to run the show, then you're going to project that onto the Jews and hate them for what you are. And I think that if there's anything that I feel about Jews is, even when you run across malice, it's sort of malice light. This is not, both in my sources and in my experience with people, I've run across real malice. And, I don't know too many Jews who fit that description. And yet that is the primary description that we're getting in TikTok and in the NGOs, in the UN, and even in the media.
So as part of this challenge of defining hostility to Jews, anti-Semitism, you've mentioned the element of a genocidal hatred, conspiracy theory.
Right.
Another concept that I came across perhaps on your Twitter feed or listened to you on YouTube, you mentioned a definition of hostility to Jews, of anti-Semitism that you came across, known as what you call the pattern. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Oh, yeah. So the pattern is this notion that was developed by a physicist named David Deutsch, who teaches at Oxford, remarkable fellow, a classic British eccentric. And the pattern, as he describes it, is the fundamental importance of the legitimacy of hurting Jews, and that people will defend this pattern unconsciously. They will defend this pattern that it should be legitimate to hurt Jews. And it's a remarkable piece of scientific thinking. I never would have thought of it in these terms as a historian. But I think that what it gets at is this unease that people have that, Henry Higgins says, let a woman in your life and your sabbatical is through. Let a Jew in your life. And, all of a sudden, you can't predict what's going to happen. You let Jews engage in the modern project, and Freud's going to come up with psychoanalysis, and Einstein's going to come up with relativity, and Boaz is going to come up with, culturally relative anthropology, and on and on. Or Marx, if you consider him Jewish, certainly I think he's much inspired by his own take. But I think that the pattern is there as a way of keeping Jews from getting too uppity. They always have to know that at some point the rug can be pulled out from under them. And what permits that, what makes it legitimate, are these lethal narratives. So I think that on some level, this pattern, which he argues is really a sort of, this is like the atomic level of anti-Semitism, calls for these lethal narratives. And so if you look at the Oslo peace process as sort of the end of the pattern. I mean, after the Nazis were defeated, it was no longer legitimate to engage in open hatred of Jews in Europe and the West, right? And the protocols of the Elders of Zion were considered, sick, genocidal conspiracy theory. But through the Arab-Israeli conflict, allowing the Arabs to continually harass Israel kept that alive, right? With the threat of the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, it was the end of the pattern. And according to Deutsch, that can't be. And, when I read him, I sort of re-looked at everything that I've been working on in the year 2000, and I thought, this illustrates his argument, which is you're very close to a situation in which it is no longer legitimate to hurt Jews. And then you have this explosion of narratives which make it legitimate and which have now spread throughout the campuses and continue to spread throughout the society. I mean, it's really catastrophic, and it was completely unexpected. And even when it was happening, somebody like Leon Wieseltier, who gets it, wrote a piece after Jenin when people were sounding the alarm about, a whole new level of anti-Semitism. And he wrote a piece called "Hitler is Dead." Forget it. Don't get hysterical.
When we look at, for example, the United Nations, a lot of people are asking me the question, why is it that the United Nations focuses so disproportionately on Israel? And I give the answer that all politics is local, and that each of the member nations of the United Nations has a population, whether they're in a democracy or a dictatorship, that either expects their leaders or are excited when their leaders condemn Israel. And this excitement would not exist if it was condemning Russians or Turks or any other of the nations. It's just not good politics locally. Well, what is it that makes it good politics locally? I imagine this is where the pattern would fit in, and it remains there, that there is this effort to justify violence against Israel. Do you see it in a similar way?
That's interesting. I used to think, and I still do at some level, think that Israel is the natural leader of what I call the fourth world, which is those peoples like the Kurds or the Berbers or the Tibetans who are the victims of third world imperialism. I mean, there's this weird tendency of post-colonialism to make anybody who was oppressed by Western imperialism into some kind of a hero. But certainly in the Arab world, where it's strong horse politics, that's not the case at all. So I see Israel as the natural leader of these sort of independent peoples, or people who want to be independent, who are being oppressed by these dictatorships who use, and therefore, since basically the UN is a democracy of dictatorships, in which the democracies that are represented there are a tiny fraction of the votes, you have this overwhelming hostility to the natural leaders of the local enemies that they have. So yes, but I think your point about the pattern is well taken. I mean, look, we know that in the South, after the emancipation of the slaves, the people who were the most angry about it were what is, I don't know if we can still use the term referred to as white trash. These were people at the bottom of the hierarchy who were white and whose only consolation was they had blacks to kick around. And now that they lost the blacks to kick around, they were furious. So, I think that's true of many of these countries, certainly in the Arab world. The Arab world is susceptible to scapegoating the Jews because it makes them feel better about themselves.
The last topic I want to cover, you could perhaps categorize it as hopium,
Yes.
is to look for reasons for optimism, where perhaps in the past
You want a dose.
people saw no hope. And the two topics I want to ask you about are Jewish-Christian relations and Jewish-Muslim relations, where today I personally deal with this. I guide a program called Passages, and it's bringing Christian Americans to Israel to learn about their roots as Christians and to learn about the Jewish people, interfaith dialogue, and so on. And I am guiding, college students, Christians, many of whom I think have no idea of the centuries-long hostility of the Christian church to Jews, because they are growing up in an atmosphere where they naturally are coming from homes where they love Israel and Jews. They want to get to know Israel and Jews. They're genuinely asking about Judaism. And so first I want to get your opinion on this trend which we're seeing, which is a relatively modern phenomenon of genuine love, and how you see this, or at least interest or normalcy.
Right.
And the second question about Jewish-Muslim relations concerns the Abraham Accords, where Israel has never had warm relations with a Muslim Arab country. We have peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, but the societies are not interacting. And we saw in the past year these treaties, you can call them, with the UAE, with Bahrain, which have produced these images of people who appear to be in video conservative, Muslim, religious, Arab, and they want to get to know Israel. They're loving to get to know us. They're respecting Jews. And this is the opposite of what Jewish Israelis have experienced for more than 70 years. So does this type of thing provide some hope that the situation in our relations with the wider Muslim or Arab world could be better? So how do you see, again, another small question, a little bit of my hopium that perhaps the future will be better than the past?
First of all, I think that the hopium that fed the Oslo process was a belief that if the Arabs just got to know us, they'd love us. We're nice people. We like to be liked. We go out of our way to do things to help people like us, including criticize ourselves publicly. And I think that there was this belief that, once the Iron Curtain was lifted, it would happen. When I was here in 94, 95, I got involved in dialogue groups with the Palestinians. It was clear to me, these people were sent to talk to us. They weren't interested in talking to us. There was no warmth. There was no, we tried to figure out how to break the ice and so on, but there was nothing there. Here, with the case of, Bahrain and UAE, there seems to be a genuine enthusiasm. And I think that that genuine enthusiasm is to some extent the product of people who are not directly involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict, who I talk a lot in my book about what I call triumphalism. Triumphalist religiosity is religiosity in which my religion must be visibly superior. And if it's not visibly superior, I feel insecure. So the only way I can feel secure is if my religion dominates the public space and you are visibly inferior as a result. And I think that, there's a strong tradition of triumphalist religiosity in Islam, both historically and presently. But I also think that it's perfectly possible for Muslims not to be triumphalist. And if they're not triumphalists, then I think they look at the Palestinians who are stuck in the most self-destructive pattern of behavior imaginable and think, this is this is crazy. And I mean, there were Arabs here in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, well, 40s, who welcomed the Jews because they saw the Jews as the way to modernize, and they saw the Christians as their real enemies, which they were. So I think that that's a perfectly rational point of view. And I think that's true of the Christians as well. And modern civil society encourages that. And that's the positive sum matrix in which things work out very nicely. The problem is that, I think everybody should reread Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom. I think it's a brilliant book. It probably there should be a new edition that cuts down the sort of lengthy discussions of Protestant theology and so on. But, his main point there is that freedom is great, but, freedom to choose, which is what freedom is about, is also freedom to choose the wrong thing. And the ability to take responsibility for the wrong choices that you make, to blame yourself for your failures rather than scapegoat other people, that's tough. Freedom is not easy. It's like we talk about, the Ukrainians want freedom, the Palestinians are free, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. What a joke. Nobody's going to be free in a Palestine run by the Palestinian leadership except for their predatory leaders. So the Jews are, from the get-go, trained in the disciplines of freedom, the cognitive dissonance that you have to endure, the mixed emotions, the self-criticism, and so on. Other people, not so much. And so in the period where things are going well, things are very warm. It's how people respond to disappointment. And, in the case of Christians, very often this goes south in periods of disappointment, partly because the Jews don't convert. There's a great line by Heine who said, it's impossible for a Jew to convert to Christianity because you'll never convince a Jew that another Jew is God, right? Which is just, it's part of our self-deprecating tradition. We're a standing insult to at least certain forms of Christian belief, and you can't get around that. And so I would say, one of the things that I would say to your Christian fellows who come is study the history of the times where Philo-Judaism turns to anti-Semitism. And if you see that starting to happen, if you see people starting to scapegoat the Jews for their disappointments and so on, don't let it go there. We've got messianism, hopium in our bones. We want to make the world a better place. We are convinced the world could be a better place. We want to participate in that process. We very often find people, non-Jews, who feel the same way, but we're never going to get there, Built into the human experience is the Yetzer Hara. There's a famous story of a village that gets rid of the Yetzer Hara and the evil inclination, and it's, the chickens stop laying eggs. Life is built on struggling with these things, and you can never get rid of the bad. And so hopium is a dangerous drug, but it's also a productive drug. I mean, my whole career has been studying messianic expectations. I don't believe, sometimes I shock my fellow Jews by saying I don't believe the Messiah is coming. I don't believe he's coming, but, messianic beliefs are like fire. Don't get too close, you'll get burned. But, they will warm you in the cold winters.
Well, Richard, we've covered a lot of ground. I know that in the show notes that I'm going to kind of go through everything we've said. link all the references to the articles, to the books that you've mentioned, and send them out to everyone who joins my list, or I'll put them in the YouTube description. But if people want to learn more about you and your work, follow you, see what you're doing, read your books, how can they find you, follow you, learn more about what you're doing?
Well, my blog, which was pretty active from about 2005 to 2015, is called The Augean Stables, theaugeanstables.com.
Meaning, what is the...
Well, the Augean Stables is one of Hercules' tasks. He had to clean out the stables of a man named Augeas, who had the largest cattle and horse herds of the entire Peloponnesian Peninsula, which is that peninsula that's the south of Greece. And he never cleaned them. So they had, decades of shit encased in the walls of these stables, and Hercules had one day to clean them out. And so there was a river nearby, and he rerouted the river to run through the stables, and he scraped the stuff off the walls and into the river, and it got carried away. And when I started the blog in 2005, that was my image for sort of the Pallywood infested media, that their bad habits, uncorrected, had encrusted the news media with this, the legacy media with this crap, and that the internet would be the river that ran through it.
So that's the name of your blog.
So that's the name of my blog. Okay. I couldn't have misnamed it better.
TheAugeanStables.com. What is the okay?
The river is bringing more crap into the stables.
People can follow you on Twitter.
They can follow me on Twitter, Richard_Landis. So that's where I'm most active right now, Twitter. And I have a Facebook page, but I don't like Facebook. I guess I don't like Twitter either, but I like Twitter. Twitter is a nice sort of brief place to... And you can link to stuff.
This may end up being a podcast of people I follow on Twitter. And
right. So those are the two places. And then I have this book that should be out sometime in the first half of this year from Academic Studies Press. And it's, I think it's going to be called Disorientations, a Medievalist Guide to the 21st Century. To the troubled 21st century.
And you have a book you published a while ago for those interested in millennial movements?
Two books that might be of interest to people. One is on millennial movements called Heaven on Earth, The Varieties of the Millennial Experience. And another one that came out the same year, which I co-edited with Stephen Katz at BU, called The Paranoid Apocalypse. And it's about the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And the argument is that the protocols get activated in periods of apocalyptic expectation, and that's what's happening right now.
Well, Professor Richard Landis, I want to thank you for being my first ever podcast guest. This is a giant experiment.
Well,
we will see how it goes. I hope it continues, and I hope I have enough guests in the future that it will be time to invite you back for another conversation.
I got to say, this went on so long, it's almost a Joe Rogan podcast.
I don't know if I should be flattered or...
I think flattered.
Lex Friedman, although I'm not in a suit and tie. Thank you again, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Be well.